Welcome to Everyday Linux User, and welcome to the next episode of How to Really Learn Linux. Today's video we're going to be talking about logging in. Now it doesn't sound very exciting, but there are a few scripts that run when you log in, and in this video I'm going to show you what those scripts are, when they run, and the useful commands that you can put in the scripts, and why these scripts are important. So, what happens when you log into Linux? When you first log into Linux, there are a series of files that run. These are shell scripts that run. And the first one that runs is the etc profile. And this is a script or set of scripts that run for every user when they log in. And it sets things like their path variable so they can run executable programs. And then you've got the etc bashrc file. Now this isn't a login script, this runs every time you open a new shell. Next you have the etc bashrc script, and this runs every time you open a new shell. So this is quite important, and I'll tell you why later on. But again, this allows you to set up a series of functions and aliases that will be available for every user. And then you have the bashrc profile, which sits in a local user directory under the home directory. It's a hidden file, and this is run every time you log in, and we'll go into a bit more detail about that later on. And then you've got the .profile, which also sits under the user's home folder as a hidden file. That's also run for an individual user at login. And then you've got the bashrc script, which also sits under the user's home folder and is a hidden file, and that runs functions and aliases, etc., that are useful for that one user. So as I said, the etc profile is a login script. It's run for all users, so every time you log in that script will be run, and it doesn't matter which user you are, that script will run. And not only that, there's a folder called etc/profile.d, and any script in that folder will run. So if you want a script to run for every single user, you generally create a script in the etc/profile.d folder, and that will run every time you log in. And the sort of thing you put in there are things like path variables, so that a user can log into, they can run executables, such as the add use command, for instance. Then you've got the etc bashrc file, and this is run not when it runs when you log in, but it runs every time you open a new shell. So every time you open a shell, it will run this script, and this is important. So you don't want to put your path variable in your bashrc script, because every time you export that path's going to get longer and longer, and I'll show you that later on. But what you tend to put in the bashrc script are functions that are common, that you want everyone to be able to run. For instance, if you want to show today's date in a particular format, you'd have a date function that would show it in a particular format. You put aliases that you want available to every single user. And we'll go into some common functions and aliases later on. And it's up to you whether you want it for all users or just a specific user. Which is where the funny symbol up here is. You see you've got the little symbol at the front, that's called a tilde, and what that means is your home folder. So when you first log in, if your name's Gary, you'll be in the home Gary folder. That is, in shorthand, is that little tilde symbol. And if a file begins with a dot, that means it's a hidden file. So the .bash profile won't be visible by default, but it runs every time you log in as a user. So if you can think of as a user, when you log in, it's going to run the etc profile script, which will run certain things for all users, and then if you want a different thing specifically to this user, you add it to the .bash profile script. It is optional, and it doesn't always exist. And functions and aliases in this file will only be available to that specific user. So if you want aliases that are specific to you for your own shorthand, then you would put it in the .bash profile script. or you would put it in the .profile script. So the .profile script is also a login script that runs every time a user logs in, and it's again optional and won't always exist. So essentially the order of precedence is if there's a .bash profile script, it will run that one and not run the .profile script. If there isn't a bash profile script, it will run the .profile script, and I'll get into why there's two in a few minutes time. Again, every function in this script is specific to the individual user that the .profile lives in. So what is the difference between bash profile and profile? And it's largely historical when it comes back from Unix days. So originally you used to, I think when Unix was first invented, there was a shell. So a shell is what you enter every time you log into a terminal window. So when I log into my Debian in a minute, I will be logging into a shell. And there are lots of different types of shells. So when it first started, there was one called the Bourne shell, and so BSH. And then a few years later, somebody came along with something called the Born Again shell, which was the Bourne shell with stuff added on. So the Born Again shell. And then you got other types of shell available. You got the C shell, the Z shell. There are loads more, but these are the common ones. So Debian, for instance, comes with the Born Again shell. So the profile script was created when the Bourne shell was the only thing available, and so all your login commands were going that profile script. But when the Bourne shell came along, because there's extra commands that are available to the Born Again shell, they wouldn't work in the Bourne shell, the normal .profile script, because they're not Bourne shell commands. And so they came up with a bash profile script which would run the bash, the Born Again commands, but then you could default back to the profile script which would run only Bourne commands. Realistically nowadays you can get away with most of the time with just using a profile script. You're not going to put enough in there that's going to make it a problem, and it's in fact the default for Debian. So it's not something to particularly concern yourself about, but that's why you've got a .bash profile and a profile script. Okay, so it's time for some practical. So I'm going to log in as Gary, and if I do an ls, it should give me a directory list of all the files in my folder, and I've got nothing, or seemingly nothing. And that is basically what you get when you install Debian without installing all the extra scripts and stuff. So your default user has nothing in it. But if you do ls-al, it will show all the hidden files, and that's the importance of today's topic, because you'll see there's a .bashrc and a .profile script. Now what I've put in, so if I go to my etc folder and I do nano on the profile, and if I scroll to the bottom, I've created a variable called all users bash profile equals 1, and the whole point of this is to show you how things run. So that one is set, so I've set that to 1, and if I look at the bashrc script, you can see I've got an all users bashrc, and if I go to my home folder, remember you can type /home /username, or you can use the tilde. So if I now nano my .bashrc script, scroll to the bottom, you'll see I've got this thing here. This is Gary user bashrc, so you can see whether that runs or not. And if I look at the .profile, you'll see there's a Gary user profile. And if I do ls-al, you'll see there isn't a .bash underscore profile. So the importance of that, I've logged in. So if I type env pipe and I do grep, and grep's a search tool. It uses regular expressions to search, and there's a topic for later on down the road. But essentially, if I type in users, you can see that all users bashrc equals 1 and all users bash profile equals 1. Now obviously, because I called the Gary one Gary user, and it hasn't shown the Gary ones, but you can see if I shorten that to user, you can see Gary user bashrc equals 1, all users bashrc equals 1, Gary user profile equals 1, and all users bash profile equals 1. So that goes back to what I was saying. Those scripts are all run when you first log in, and also the bashrc scripts run every time you start a new terminal. So if you start a terminal and you're already logged in, it's not going to necessarily run the profile scripts again. So if I now do nano.bash profile, and I type export Gary user bash profile equals 1, and I exit, and I'm going to log in again. So if I now do env Gary again, you'll see that only Gary user bash profile was set to 1 and not the Gary user profile was set to 1. So I'm going to remove that because I don't want the .bash profile. And if I exit out and I go into Gary and type env Gary again, sorry, env grep Gary, you'll see both the variables are back to being set. So that lets you know basically what files are run and what you want to do. So we're going to start off with the profile, and the thing you'll notice, so we haven't got anything in the folder, and one of the things you'll notice is if you try and run certain commands, they won't work properly, even though they are native to Debian, and so they do exist. So if I clear the screen and I type where is add user, you'll see it's in the user sbin add user folder. So if I type add user as Gary, you'll say it says command not found, and you might think, well, Gary is just a normal user, he shouldn't have permissions to run the add user command, which is reasonable. So we'll switch to the root command, root user. So if you type su and type in the password, that logs you in as the root user, and you can see by my username there, it's root at Debian base. I'm still in the home Gary folder. But if I type add user, the add user command is not found. So there's two things I can do here. I can either add user to my root bashrc root profile script, or I can add it to the etc profile script. It depends if you want add user to be available to all users. Now, I don't think you want add user to be available to all users because it's going to give a permission thing, but I am going to do it because if you do give permissions to a user to be able to add users, you don't want them to then have to change their profile script to be able to run it, or have to run that full command. So you could type user sbin add user, and you can see it gives a different output because I haven't given it a name to add a user in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the etc folder, and you can either edit the profile, or you can put something in the profile.d. Now, because it's just a single command, I'm going to put it into the profile notepad, nano profile, and we're going to need to remember where add user is. So it's in user sbin. So if we go nano profile, we can do export path equals path colon and then user sbin, like that. And what that's doing is taking the current path variable, and it's attaching user sbin to the end of it. So before I save that, I'm going to exit out and say no, so you can see what the current path variable is, and you can do env get path like that, or you can generally just do echo path and it'll do the same thing. And you can see the current path is user local bin, user bin, and then bin, and it's user local game. So they're the folders it's going to use to look for programs that can be run. And we want to add user sbin onto that. So go back into the profile, down the bottom, export path equal $path colon forward user forward sbin, and then we just save it. There is a Nano guide on this channel. It was made quite a long time ago, so I will need to update it, but Nano doesn't really change, so everything I said back in 2013 or 14 should still be relevant today. So it's Control O to save a file and Control X to exit. And so now I'm going to exit. I'm going to exit again. So let's prove the point. So if I log in as Gary, can I do add user? Yes, but it's giving me a message, only root may add a user or group to the system. So that shows me that the add user command is now available, but permissions stops me from running it. If I switch to root, I type add user, this time it's saying add user, you need to give a name. And to prove the point, let's add a user called Fred. And it's asking for a password for Fred. And then you can add some details. This is something for another lecture, another guide. So you can see now Fred has been added. So that's the importance of the profile script. And you want to export your path using the profile script, not the bashrc script, because the bashrc script runs every single time you open a shell. So you only want it when you log in. You don't need to export it every single time you open a new shell. Now obviously we've only got one terminal here, but if I type sh, I'm now entering a new shell. If I type sh again, I'm entering a new shell, and I'm entering a new shell, and each time it's going to take me 3 times to get back, 4 times to get back to my home, to my root user, and exit out again to get to my Gary user. So every time you go down, you're entering a new shell. So what can we put into the bashrc script? The bashrc script is a useful place to put functions and aliases that you want to use in your system. So if I do pwd shows you your present working directory. If I nano my bashrc and scroll down, you'll see at the bottom it says alias definitions. You may want to put all your additions in a separate file called .bashaaliases instead of adding them directly here. So in this file it's actually created an if statement that says if there's a bash alias script, then run it. But you can put all your aliases here, and I'm going to add a few in and show you how they can be useful. So I've edited my bashrc and added some aliases in. Now aliases are good if you understand Linux and you can remember the commands. They're not so good if you're new, because you'll forget what the actual command is, or so for instance I've got an alias here called ... and what that do is move you up a directory. If you forget that the command to change directory is cd, then that means when you go to another Linux box you'll forget how to move around the system if you've made an alias for all of the system commands. So whilst aliases are good once you learn Linux, they're not so good whilst you are learning Linux, because you forget the actual commands. Now the ones I've got here are fairly basic. ... moves you up a directory, shows you history, various directory commands, a path variable, a bit about time, memory usage and CPU usage. So if you add these in, you can use nano for this. To edit a file you can type nano.bashrc and you just type in the commands, and to save the file, it's Control O, and exit is Control X. So you put these commands in, you exit out, and you log back in, and your bashrc is going to work. So there's a command called tail, so if I do tail minus n20 for instance on bashrc, it's going to show me the last 20 lines of that file, and that means I can see what aliases I have. So if I do pwd, you can see there's I'm in my home Gary folder. Pwd stands for present working directory. If I do ... I'm now in my home directory. So that's the cd ... working. If I type history, it shows me a history of commands. I've got an alias now that does h, which shows me the history commands as well. So if I clear and do h, it shows the history of commands. You can see the last 4 commands are history, h, clear, and h. Another reason why aliases aren't necessarily so good is your history is built up of aliases rather than the actual command that was run. So we'll do the tail again. So we're clear. We have to go back into our Gary folder for the tail to work. So ls, I've got a test file that I've created and a test2 folder, and you can see that's colorized. LSA shows me all of the files in the folder, so that includes all the hidden files, AMA test and test2 folder. And then there's LSH, shows me just the hidden files. If I want to see what's in the path command, just type path, and you can see these are the folders it will start looking to start running programs. And now there's a bit of date processing, so I've got now, shows me the current date and time. I've got now time, just shows me the time, and I've got now date, just shows me the date. If I want to see my memory info, I can type memory info. And you can see it's 289 megabytes, and if I want to see CPU info, I can type CPU info, and it gives me details about my CPU usage. So that's where aliases are useful. As mentioned before, it did say that it's a good idea to put your aliases in this .bash aliases file. So what I'm going to do is show you a quick way of doing that without having to type all the commands in again. We know that the tail command lists out the last few lines of a file, and we can see that I've got 10 aliases there. So if I do this, you'll see I've got all of my aliases. So what I can do is I can pipe that out to a new file, and I'll call that .bash aliases, and the T command writes to a file. So you can see I've now got a bash alias file. If I nano into that, I've got my 10 commands there. I've actually got 9 commands. I probably wanted to do 11 rather than 10. I'm just going to type in the CD one. And then obviously you then have to edit your .bashrc and move out the ones that are here. And you can press Ctrl K to move lines within Nano, and Ctrl O to save, and Ctrl X to exit. And if I exit out and I log in again to prove that the aliases file is working, so present working directory, if I do ... you can see it's moved into the home, and if I do memory info, my aliases are still working. So you put all your aliases into the bash aliases file, and that's one from the bashrc script anyway. So the bashrc script isn't just used for adding aliases, you can also add functions, and that's what I'm going to show you next. So in your bashrc script, you're not just limited to using aliases, you can add other things as well. So as an example, if I edit my bashrc script, I've added this function here. It's called md, and what it does is it makes the directory and then it automatically puts you into that directory. So to see that in action, I'm going to exit out, I'm going to log back in, and I'm in my Gary folder. So I'm going to make a directory the old-fashioned way. I'm just going to call it test3, and you'll see that I'm still in the home Gary folder. So if I want to go to test3, I have to cd into test3. But I don't want to do that. So if I look at my bash script again, you'll see my folder's called, my function's called md. So what I can do is I'm going to create a folder called test4. So md test4, and you can see if I do pwd now, I'm in home Gary test4. So you can add a whole, if you can learn a bit of bash scripting, you can find functions on forums. Be careful when you're using these things, because there are some malicious people out there that will tell you to put in commands that will delete every file in your system. So just be careful what you're typing in. Try and understand what you're reading before you blindly copy and paste. But essentially you can get some useful functions from various sources. Another thing people quite like to do is they like the coloured thing called neofetch. Now if I clear my screen and I do where is neofetch, you can see it's not installed, but we can install software using the apt command. It's worth doing an update first, apt update. It says I've got permission denied, so I have to do this as root, so su. So apt update, that will pull in all the latest repositories. Apt upgrade is also a good idea for keeping your system up to date. You can see mine's completely up to date, but then you just want to do apt install neofetch. And just press Y when it asks. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do nano and the .bashrc again. And at the bottom we're going to type neofetch. Remember, this bash script runs every single time you open a new shell. So every time you log in, basically it's going to run this. Or if you're using a graphical user interface and open a terminal, it's going to run this bash script. So by typing neofetch there, it's going to run the neofetch command. And as long as neofetch is in the correct folder of one of the path variables, it's going to run. So we'll try that out now. Control O, Control X, exit, and then we'll exit again. And if I log in as Gary, you can see I get the neofetch thing come up, and it tells you a little bit about your system. And it shows I'm using 125 meg by default just by logging in. So that's where I want to leave it today. What we've covered today, we've covered the different types of scripts that are run every time you log in, the difference between the profiles and the bashrc script, the difference between the etc scripts and the local scripts, why there's a bash profile and a profile script, and things like that. So in the next video I'm going to be talking about user management, and that's really it for today. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button to see more of these tutorials as we go along, and I'll see you next time on Everyday Linux User.